Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for September 9th, 2021. This morning I'm going to take you outside the bubble of the Western media when it comes to the situation in Afghanistan. What is clear is that we're being submitted to a kind of brainwashing, which essentially starts from the idea that the war was good and necessary, which ignores the whole question of what caused the war in the first place, which we'll be taking up this Saturday in an event on looking at the whole question of 9/11. But as though this was a virtuous war, we were doing what was right, we did the right thing for Afghanistan. It wasn't wrong to stay for 20 years. In fact, it was wrong to withdraw when we did. That there's something wrong with Afghanistan inherently, that the Chinese are looking to benefit from the situation there. There are all these stories that are out there in the media, all of which ignore the fact that Afghanistan has essentially been in a war since 1979, when the United States first began equipping what became the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Before the Russian invasion in December 1979, that war continued throughout the 80s until the Russians eventually left in defeat. Then the war started again in 2001. So the country has been under wartime conditions for most of the last 40 years. That's why there's a humanitarian crisis. That's why the situation there is chaotic. And the attempt to convince the American people that we should have stayed or should go back in is part of the way the media is covering the events there. I mean, just one example, there's a lot of irresponsible commentary about how China is going to be the biggest beneficiaries of the Taliban takeover. Now, this is a classic example of geopolitical thinking, that anything that happens in the world is either for or against the United States, and that there's no way that we can operate in between the idea that we have enemies that we have to combat and friends we have to protect. And this is in line with thinking of the so-called Asia pivot of Obama, which is that we need to be more involved in containing China and also containing Russia. So we can't afford to stay in Afghanistan. That was part of the original idea about why we should leave. Helga Zepp-LaRouche has been clear in saying the key to the reconstruction of Afghanistan is to bring the Belt and Road Initiative of China in as a policy, to develop the country, to create corridors of development that connect Afghanistan, which is a landlocked country, with its neighbors east, west, north, and south, and to use that as the basis for economic development. On the other side, you have people like Lindsey Graham, General Milley, who are saying we expect a civil war, we expect chaos, we expect terrorism, we expect an increase in opium production, and therefore, as Graham said, we have to go back into Afghanistan. This is a guy who hasn't learned a damn thing from the endless wars that hopefully we're going to begin to end. So let's look at what the Chinese are actually doing in Afghanistan. There was an online meeting on September 5th, which had foreign ministers from China, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Pakistan, and Iran. And one of the people who participated was the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. And he welcomed the pledges made by the Taliban that they would respect ethnic differences, respect the rights of women, crack down on terrorism and drug production. And what he said is that these pledges must be followed by specific actions, including broad tolerance and combating terrorism and drugs. And here's his quote. He said, "It is hoped that the Taliban can learn from historic experience, actively interact with all ethnic groups and factions in Afghanistan during the interim government, earnestly fulfill their commitments, and strive for international recognition," with international recognition being dependent on doing what they said they're going to do. And he made the point that the humanitarian crisis was caused not by something internal in Afghanistan, but the U.S. and NATO war, and said that the U.S. and NATO therefore have more of a duty than other nations to help with humanitarian assistance and economic development. And he expressed support particularly for the Taliban anti-terrorism and anti-drug policy. And essentially, China and Russia are among the most affected by if Afghanistan becomes a launching point for terrorist operations and for drug trafficking. The Uyghur separatist movement, the terrorists in China, the Chechen terrorists, many of them were trained in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria, and then deployed back into Russia, back into China. And so they have a vested interest in making sure that Afghanistan does not become a safe haven for terrorists or for drugs, because much of the drug problem in Russia was a result of its involvement in the Afghan war. Now, compare the discussion of China and Russia, and even the Taliban, about cutting back on opium production, with the drug legalization push going on in the United States. I'm just suggesting you think about that. Now, Helge has called for the appointment of Pino Arlacchi to coordinate the aid programs so that we have not military humanitarian corridors, but actual commitment to economic construction in Afghanistan. Arlacchi worked with the Taliban when he was the Director General of the UN Drug Control Agency in the late 90s. He worked with them especially in 1999 and 2000, where there was a huge drop in opium poppy production under the Taliban government. More than 90% decrease in the amount of opium coming from Afghanistan. That changed after the war in 2001 began, to the point that Afghanistan again became the world's leading source by a huge amount of international poppy traffic, poppy production and opium traffic. So bringing in Arlacchi, who is trusted by the Taliban, who's worked with them, and could be an honest broker in working to assure that the humanitarian assistance includes a policy of reducing drug production. That would be a step forward. Now, I want to point out one other notable change on China policy, or China discussion, which came from a somewhat unexpected source, Tucker Carlson of Fox News, who last Friday, I believe it was, spoke of what he called two virtuous actions by the Chinese government. The first was banning private equity funds from raising money to invest in residential real estate. Carlson said the Chinese government issued a statement saying houses are for living in, not for speculation. And he said this is something we in the United States should think about, where we have the skyrocketing prices of housing as a result of speculation, just as we did in the build-up to the 2007-2008 crash. It's interesting that China doing this puts it much more in line with the traditional American approach, which was best expressed in the movie It's a Wonderful Life, the beautiful Frank Capra directed movie about George Bailey of the Savings and Loan, who saw housing as a way to improve people's lives, not as a basis for wealth accumulation and speculation by the wealthy. Now, he also referred to the Chinese government's campaign against celebrity worship online and video games, where the Chinese have announced that young people are limited to 3 hours a week of participating in video games. And instead, Xi Jinping said, we want our youth focused on science, engineering, areas that will benefit the nation, as opposed to becoming addicted to video games. Now, Carlson then finished the segment by saying, when was the last time you heard a U.S. political leader even mention video games or real estate speculation as a problem? Well, that's an interesting point. And again, just as I said earlier, where we're demanding the Taliban crack down on drug production, we're seeing major efforts to legalize all sorts of drugs in the United States. You can see a bit of hypocrisy there, can't you? Now, Helge Zepp-LaRouche, in yesterday's weekly dialogue with me, which is available at theschillerinstitute.com, did discuss the Chinese policy toward video games, and I think it'd be very useful for people to listen to that. So there'll be more coming on Afghanistan and the relationship to 9/11, why we need to once and for all get the truth about 9/11. The Schiller Institute is sponsoring a conference this Saturday, September 11th, beginning at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. I'll be one of the co-moderators. I invite you to join us with that. You can register for it at theschillerinstitute.com. As today is Thursday, tomorrow I'll be taking your questions. Send your questions to me directly to harleysch@gmail.com. See you tomorrow.